The Mecha Warlord's Guide to Conquering Fantasy Worlds. Prologue. War at the Edge of Extinction. The world was burning. From orbit, Earth must have looked like a dying ember, its once blue atmosphere choked with black smoke, its surface scarred by craters and the jagged skeletons of ruined cities. Across the sky, shattered orbital stations and the wreckage of long-lost battles drifted like fireflies, burning up as they fell. Captain Reid Voss sat in the cockpit of Fenrir, watching the chaos unfold, not with fear, not even with despair, just tired resignation. "Pilot Voss!" came a smooth, synthetic voice through his helmet. "You have entered designated combat coordinates. Power levels at 89%. Weapon systems at 92% readiness. Neural link stable." Reid flexed his hands against his flight suit's neural-threaded gloves, feeling the machine react before he even moved the controls. It was like flexing phantom limbs. Fenrir was his body now, his 6-story-tall, 6-legged, multi-cannon death machine of a body. And yet they were still losing this war. "Hey, Fenrir," Reid muttered, his voice crackling through his suit's old comms unit. "Remind me, what are the odds of us making it out of this one?" There was a short pause. Then the AI answered in its usual monotone. "Survival probability, 12.4%. Reid snorted. "Well, that's higher than last week." Below, the battlefield stretched for miles, or at least what was left of it. The once proud city of New Orion had been reduced to rubble, its streets turned to trenches, its skyscrapers now skeletal towers of melted steel. Once, it had been a beacon of humanity's future, a shining jewel of technology and progress. Now it was just another graveyard waiting for its tenants. Beyond the ruins on the western horizon, the Union of Allied States, UAS, and the Orion Dominion were locked in their final battle. Massive mechs clashed in the distance, bipedal juggernauts exchanging autocannon fire that lit up the night like fireworks. Gunships weaved between burning high-rises, spitting out missiles before being shredded by ground-based plasma artillery. Soldiers, tiny specks compared to the war machines, charged through the rubble, fighting over land that no longer mattered. But Reid and his Helldiver Legion weren't here to win this fight. They were here to buy time. Above them, the last of the evacuation ships, Ark-class transports the size of floating cities, were slowly ascending toward the orbital docks, trying to escape the planet before it was too late. If those ships didn't get out, then there wouldn't be any humans left to fight for, and humanity's final, desperate attempt at survival would end before it even began. "All right, Helldivers, listen up," came Commander Briggs's voice over the comms. He was leading their final stand from Omega Point, a hastily fortified command center in the ruins of what had once been a government complex. You know the drill. This isn't about glory, and it sure as hell isn't about victory. We're holding this line until the last ship is clear. A chorus of confirmations came across the channel. 13 Helldiver pilots remained. Reid was one of them. 13 left. He exhaled slowly. At the start of this war, there had been over 1,000. "Voss," Briggs continued, his tone flat and professional. "You're running the Fenrir prototype. You have one job. Make those Dominion bastards think twice before pushing forward." "Copy that, Commander," Reid replied, adjusting Fenrir's targeting optics. "I'll make 'em dance." Briggs exhaled, the sound of static following her pause. "Good hunting, Captain." Then the channel went silent. 30 seconds later, everything went to hell. "Contact. Multiple signatures, far side of the planet." Reid's gut tightened at the sound of Lieutenant Johnson's voice over the comms. His squad's recon specialist was running enhanced long-range scans, but there was something in his voice, a slight hitch. "What kind of signatures?" Commander Briggs' voice came through, calm but clipped. A long pause. Then Johnson's voice came back strained. "Unknown." The cockpit of Fenrir was silent for a moment, save for the low hum of the mech's power core. Reid's hands instinctively tightened around the controls. "Unknown. That was never a good word." "Get me visuals," Briggs ordered. Reid tapped into Fenrir's sensor feed, routing the long-range data to his own HUD. A live transmission flickered into view, a dark, grainy image of the far side of Earth's orbit, where the last wrecks of the old space stations still floated like drifting tombstones. Then suddenly they weren't alone anymore. A fleet emerged, not through warp gates, not through known jump lanes, but as if they had simply appeared. Massive, obsidian-hulled ships, impossibly sleek, with no exhaust signatures, no thermal output. Dead silent. And they weren't UAS. And they weren't Dominion. What the hell are those? Graves, Reid's longtime wingman, muttered through the comms. Briggs hesitated. Johnson, confirm. Are those Dominion reinforcements? Another pause. Then, no, Johnson whispered. There's something else. And that was when the first orbital strike hit. 1 second, the battlefield was the usual hellscape of mechs tearing through ruined buildings, gunships strafing ground troops, fire and plasma illuminating the wreckage. The next second, everything was light. White-hot beams of energy lanced down from the blackened sky, striking like surgical lightning bolts. Mechs, tanks, entire regiments of soldiers gone. Not vaporized, not even burned, just gone. "We're under fire!" someone screamed over the comms. Reid barely had time to register the pure chaos erupting around him when Fenrir's targeting HUD lit up like a Christmas tree. Targets inbound. Fast. He turned just in time to see them. The Skybreakers. They came rolling in like a tide, hundreds of them. No, not rolling, adapting, changing, shifting. At first, they almost looked human-sized, sleek, black-shelled war machines, sprinting on digitigrade legs like nightmare hounds. But as they encountered resistance, they changed, reconfigured themselves on the fly, grew taller, bulkier, sprouted more armor plating, new weapons, and they didn't move like mechs. They moved like predators. One launched itself at a nearby Helldiver unit, its arms reshaping mid-air, morphing into razor-thin monomolecular blades. The pilot never even had time to scream. The Helldivers opened fire. Reid snapped into action, yanking Fenrir's controls and bringing the mech's twin railguns online. He locked onto the closest Skybreaker, its form twisting like a digital glitch, and pulled the trigger. Boom. The round tore straight through its core, ripping it in half, but the pieces didn't fall. They shifted, rebuilt themselves, and the damn thing kept coming. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Reid muttered. He didn't wait to see if it would adapt a second time. Fenrir's thrusters fired, launching the massive war machine across the ruined battlefield, crushing debris beneath its 6 mechanized legs. As Reid moved, he switched to overcharged plasma rounds, firing into the advancing wave of Skybreakers. "Helldivers, break formation!" Briggs' voice snapped through the comms. "I repeat, break formation. These things are adapting to our attack patterns." "No shit!" Graves shouted back. The battle dissolved into absolute chaos. The Skybreakers weren't just evolving, they were learning. Helldiver after Helldiver fell. Their mechs dismantled in seconds. The pilots didn't even have time to eject. "Voss, on your 6!" Reid turned just in time to see a Skybreaker vaulting toward him, its limbs splitting into needle-like spikes meant to punch through armor. He slammed Fenrir sideways, barely avoiding the attack, and activated the mech's energy blade, a 5-meter plasma-edged sword. With a single arc, he bisected the Skybreaker, but its severed halves morphed into 2 smaller forms before hitting the ground. "This is bullshit!" Reid shouted. "Graves! On your left!" But it was too late. Graves, one of the last Helldivers left, was fighting 3 Skybreakers at once. His mech was already burning, armor plating stripped away in places, exposing the inner framework. He took out one, blasting it apart with a close-range railgun shot. He took out 2, smashing it under his mech's armored knee. But the third one phased through the debris, moved too fast, and plunged a shifting, tendril-like blade straight through his cockpit. Reid's heart stopped. Graves' comms cut to static, and then his mech collapsed. The Helldivers were gone. Reid was alone, and the evacuation ship still needed more time. "Voss? Do you copy?" Briggs's voice was strained, barely audible through the interference. "We need to stall them. Just another 3 minutes." 3 minutes? Against an army of self-learning AI war machines that just slaughtered an entire elite battalion? Sure, no problem. Reid's grip tightened on Fenrir's controls. "Fine!" He kicked Fenrir's thrusters into overdrive, launched himself straight into the swarm, and started cutting. This war was lost. But if he could buy just 3 minutes, maybe humanity still had a chance. 3 minutes to hold. Reid plunged straight into the chaos, Fenrir's thrusters firing at max output as he tore through the advancing Skybreakers. His railgun pounded out hypervelocity slugs, each round ripping through the morphing metal of the enemy war machines, only for them to adapt faster, move smarter, counter harder. The battlefield was a burning hellscape, bodies and wreckage littering the ruins. The last of the Helldivers were dead. Fenrir was alone. 2 minutes to hold. The Skybreakers shifted tactics. Instead of charging, they began to encircle him, moving with an eerie, predatory precision. They were learning his patterns, anticipating his moves before he made them. 1 minute to hold. Reid knew he wasn't making it out of this. Still, his hands never hesitated, his mind never wavered. Just keep swinging, just keep firing, keep them busy. 1 more second, 1 more breath. Then Fenrir's AI pinged a priority alert. Warning! Fenrir's synthetic voice cut through the comms, its usual calm replaced with something close to urgency. Unidentified energy surge detected. Origin, extraorbital. Reid's HUD flickered, a sensor alert flashing red. He barely had time to check it before Johnson's voice, the Helldiver recon specialist, cut through the comms. Command, we've got a new... Static. Then the sky split open. A massive rift tore itself into existence above the battlefield. Not a ship, not a weapon, not anything human. It was raw energy, folding space like crumpled paper, its edges shimmering with impossible colors. And from its center, a beam of pure annihilation erupted downward. Reid barely had time to react before everything turned white. Heat. Light. A roar so loud it drowned out thought itself. For the briefest of moments, Reid wasn't in his cockpit anymore. He was everywhere. His mind flickered with impossible images, things that didn't make sense. A ruined world with twin suns, a massive black spire floating over a landscape of liquid metal, something with too many eyes staring through the rift. Then reality slammed back into place. His cockpit alarms screamed, systems blinking out 1 by 1. Power core critical, armor integrity at 3%. Warning! Dimensional breach detected. The shockwave from the beam had vaporized the battlefield, wiping out every remaining Skybreaker, but Fenrir was still standing, barely, and somehow he was the only one left alive. His vision blurred, blood dripping down his forehead from where he'd slammed into the cockpit seat. His arms were heavy, his breath shallow, his entire body numb from the neural overload. But through the haze, one thing was clear: the transports were still moving. Somehow, someway, they were still making it to orbit. Reid's chest rose and fell with ragged relief. Commander Briggs? He coughed into the comms. Static. Then a voice barely audible. Voss? You're still... Reid ignored the question. He was dying, or about to be. Didn't matter. Get them out of here, he said, forcing strength into his voice. Now. Briggs hesitated. Acknowledged. Reid let his head rest against the seat. He'd done it. He'd given them the time they needed. But the rift wasn't done with him. Fenrir's AI pinged an emergency alert, its voice no longer calm. Critical error detected. Dimensional destabilization imminent. Pilot life signs unstable. Reid barely had time to register what that meant before his cockpit filled with light again. Only this time it wasn't from the battlefield. The air crackled around him, the very fabric of reality folding inward. His vision blurred, not from pain but from something else. Something pulling him, ripping him away. And then the world exploded. Light. Sound. A final gut-wrenching sensation of falling. Then, nothing. Chapter 1. Awakening in a Broken World. Silence. No battle chatter. No alarms. No screaming warnings from Fenrir's AI. Just silence. Reid Voss was floating. Or at least it felt like floating. His body was numb, weightless, caught between consciousness and something deeper, something darker. For a moment he thought he was dead. Then pain dragged him back. A slow, creeping pulse of agony bloomed at the base of his skull and spread like wildfire through his limbs. He sucked in a sharp breath and reality crashed over him. His lungs worked. His heart pounded. He was alive. Why am I alive? The last thing he remembered was light. Blinding, searing light, and a sensation of falling that had seemed endless. The battle, the skybreakers, the orbital cannon, the rift. His mind swam, grasping at half-formed memories, but they dissolved like smoke. Groaning, he forced his eyes open. Darkness greeted him. Then a weak flicker of red emergency lights from Fenrir's control panel pulsed through the cockpit, casting harsh shadows against the reinforced plating. The familiar hum of the mech's power core was gone, replaced by a strained, stuttering whine. The air smelled sharp, burnt wiring, scorched metal, and something acrid like an overloaded capacitor. Reid tried to sit up, but his muscles screamed in protest. His neural link was still active, barely, but it felt like trying to move through tar. Every motion was sluggish, unresponsive. His fingers twitched against the flight suit's interface gloves, and Fenrir's system readout flickered weakly across his HUD. Status report: power reserves 7%, critical. Primary weapons offline. Defensive systems offline. Right arm servos, unresponsive. Communications, non-functional. AI link, partial connection. Structural integrity, 52%. Compromised, stabilizing. Great. So, basically, he was sitting inside a 6-story, multi-ton piece of scrap metal. He tried activating the external sensors, but the display sputtered and died. The mech's AI, normally a constant presence in his mind, was eerily silent. No tactical assessments, no situational readouts, just the occasional garbled line of code flashing across his screen before vanishing into static. Reid exhaled, pressing the heel of his hand against his forehead. His whole body ached, but at least his suit's life support systems were still functional. Small mercies. He reached out and toggled a secondary power relay, forcing Fenrir's optics to reboot. The system struggled, flickering between failure and functionality before finally stabilizing. And that's when he saw where he was. Through Fenrir's cracked external feed, Reid saw something impossible. The sky was wrong. Not the dull gray haze of Earth's polluted atmosphere, not the choking black smoke of orbital bombardment. Instead, it was blue. A deep, rich shade, the kind he'd only seen in old pre-war photographs. And there were 2 moons. His mind blanked for a second, refusing to process what he was seeing. 2 moons, hanging side by side in the sky like celestial sentinels. One was massive, a pale silver orb with a jagged scar running across its surface. The other was smaller, tinted a faint, eerie blue. He forced himself to scan lower. The terrain stretched out before him. Rolling hills, distant forests, and jagged mountain peaks untouched by war. No ruined skyscrapers. No craters left by kinetic bombardments. Just nature. Then he saw the crater, or rather his crater. A massive scorched impact site surrounded Fenrir, its edges still smoking from the sheer force of his crash. Trees on the outskirts had been flattened. The ground was torn apart in long, jagged furrows where his mech must have skidded upon landing. Reid's stomach tightened. He had fallen from orbit, through a rift in reality, and somehow he was still breathing. Reid swallowed against the dryness in his throat and ran another diagnostic. The numbers weren't good. The mech's right arm was completely offline. Several armor plates had buckled from the impact, leaving Fenrir exposed in critical areas. The power core was in a dangerous low-power state. If it dropped any further, it would shut down entirely, and rebooting it without external assistance would be next to impossible. The worst part? The mech's AI was barely there. The system flickered in and out, its processes garbled. Whatever the rift had done, it had scrambled Fenrir's internal systems. Reid exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. All right. Think, Voss. Figure it out. 1. He was stranded. 2. His mech was crippled. 3. No comms. No weapons. No backup. Best case scenario? He was on some unknown part of Earth, a place untouched by the war. Maybe a hidden valley, maybe an old nature reserve, something. Worst case scenario? He wasn't on Earth at all. Reid leaned back against the cockpit seat and let out a slow breath. All right, he muttered, voice hoarse. Let's break this down. This isn't Earth. Fenrir is barely holding together. I feel like I got kicked in the skull by a grav tank. No rescue coming. His fingers drummed against the armrest of his seat. Yeah, okay. This is bad. A sigh. Could be worse. A pause. Nope. This is pretty damn bad. He shifted, ignoring the way his ribs protested the movement. First priority was getting Fenrir stable. If the power core fully failed, he wasn't just losing his mech. He was losing his best chance at survival. Reid reached out, toggling a few manual overrides, forcing the mech into low-power stasis mode to conserve energy. Power reserves, 5%. Great. Then, through the static of his sensors, a flicker of movement appeared at the edge of the crater. He wasn't alone. Reid froze. His breath hitched as a faint tremor ran through Fenrir's damaged hull, motion sensors flickering to life despite their half-dead state. Ghostly outlines of figures registered on the barely functional thermal scan, moving just beyond the lip of the crater. Multiple contacts. The mech's battered optics struggled to focus, distorting with flickers of static before stabilizing. A handful of shapes lurked at the edge of the impact zone, shadowed by the smoke and uneven terrain. They were human, or at least humanoid, but they weren't dressed in battlefield fatigues, exo-armor, or anything even remotely modern. Steel plate, chainmail, leather. Swords glinted beneath the twin moons, their edges sharp and polished, not scavenged remnants of a world lost to war. And among them, oddest of all, stood a few figures holding staffs, crackling faintly with energy. Reid's gut twisted. That wasn't right. That wasn't right at all. Something about the air had changed too. His HUD flickered erratically, struggling against an unseen force. Then, warning, foreign interference detected. His entire display blinked out for a full second before slowly, sluggishly rebooting. The mech shuddered. The power core dimmed briefly, struggling to compensate for whatever the hell was pushing against it. Reid clenched his jaw. This wasn't just environmental interference. Something here actively resisted technology. One of the soldiers took a slow step forward, his armor clanking softly in the night air. A sword, broad and heavy, rested at his side, its pommel wrapped in worn leather. His free hand hovered near the hilt, but he didn't draw, not yet. The way he moved, the way the others flanked him, it wasn't the reckless charge of some warband. They were assessing him, and they were speaking. Reid barely caught the words at first. A hushed, hurried murmur between them, their voices thick with an accent that sounded ancient, old even by Earth standards. He caught something like eterna, a word he recognized from his limited Latin studies. Eternal? Another voice, younger and nervous, whispered something that sounded an awful lot like demonium. Reid exhaled through his nose. Demon. Great. A few of the soldiers dropped to their knees, murmuring rapid prayers in what might have been supplication. Or fear. The ones still standing looked wary, unsure, their knuckles white on their weapons. The leader, the one who had stepped forward, tilted his head up toward Fenrir's towering form and barked something. This time Reid caught it clearly. Name thyself! Okay, that was definitely Old English. No comms. No translators. No way to respond in a way they'd understand. Reid grimaced, fingers twitching over his controls. His mech's weapons were offline. Not that he wanted to turn this into a firefight, but he needed an edge. His usual tactics weren't going to work. Intimidation was pointless if they didn't understand him. And given that some of them were literally kneeling, he needed to tread carefully. Still, a little presence never hurt. Reid activated Fenrir's external speakers with a flick of his wrist. A sharp whine cut through the night as the system powered up. The soldiers flinched. Good. He rose, slowly, deliberately. Fenrir's servos groaned, pistons shuddering under the strain, but the mech stood, looming over the crater like an iron colossus. It was huge compared to the men below, a monstrous thing of metal and shattered power, even in its crippled state. The air went deathly still. The soldiers did not move. A few wavered on their feet, gripping weapons tighter. One of them, young, barely more than a boy, made a choked sound and dropped his sword entirely, backing away like he'd just seen a ghost. Reid made sure to keep his movements measured, slow enough not to spook them, but just fast enough to remind them that he was watching. All right, he muttered under his breath. Moment of truth. And then through the speakers, he spoke. Stand not in my path. The words echoed through the night, amplified by Fenrir's external audio, the sound unnatural, inhumanly deep. His voice came out warped, metallic and distorted, not by design, but because his systems were barely holding together. But it worked. The soldiers staggered back, gripping their weapons tight. A few of them looked ready to bolt, but their leader, the one with the broadsword, held firm, his face unreadable beneath his helmet. Another tense moment passed. Then, the man slowly reached up and removed his helm, revealing deep-set gray eyes and a thick, battle-worn scar running down his cheek. He studied Fenrir, then Reid as if weighing something unseen. Finally, in a slow, measured voice, he spoke again. Are thou of the heavens? Reid blinked. Well, that was new. The silence between them stretched, thick and expectant. The leader of the soldiers, scarred, gray-eyed, and standing firm despite the tremor in his stance, watched Fenrir with a mix of awe and calculation. Reid still hadn't answered the question. Are thou of the heavens? A dozen other men shifted uneasily, some clutching their weapons, others looking down, as if they dared not meet his gaze. One of them, still kneeling in the dirt, whispered something over and over again. A single word Reid couldn't quite catch. He should have corrected them, told them the truth. He was no divine being, no emissary of celestial power. Just a very tired man sitting inside a half-dead war machine, stranded in a world that made no damn sense. But survival had a funny way of overriding honesty. Never been mistaken for a god before. Reid's fingers hovered over the speaker controls, debating. Play along? See where this goes? Hell, it wasn't like he had a better plan. Then one of the soldiers dropped fully to his knees, pressing his forehead to the dirt. A second followed. A third. And just like that, almost half of them were bowing before him. Reid blinked. Well, that escalated quickly. The murmuring grew louder. He strained to catch the words now echoing through the group. Words repeated in reverence and, if he wasn't mistaken, fear. Ferrum Dominus, Iron Lord. Oh! A slight grin pulled at the corner of his mouth before he wiped it away. This could work. The leader, still the only one standing, took a slow step forward. His sword remained at his side, but his grip was tight, the tendons in his hand standing out like iron cords. He studied Fenrir's battered frame, its towering presence still dwarfing everything around it. Thou art Warforged? Reid made a thoughtful sound, fingers tapping against his console. Warforged. Yeah, that sounded appropriately mysterious. He could say nothing, keep them guessing, make them think he was something beyond their comprehension. Or, the warning klaxon shrieked through his half-dead systems before he could decide. Something was approaching. His HUD flickered, barely able to process the incoming thermal signatures through the interference that clung to the air like static. But even with his crippled sensors, he could see dust rising in the distance, kicked up by approaching riders. A group, fast-moving, armed. His gut twisted. Whatever was happening here, whoever these men were, they weren't alone. The kneeling soldier, the first to bow, snapped his head up at the sight of the riders and shouted something sharp, panicked. The leader's expression darkened. He knew them. That was all the confirmation Reid needed. These weren't reinforcements. They were enemies. The leader turned back to Fenrir, looking up at the towering machine as if searching for an answer. He hesitated only a second before raising his blade high into the air, his voice ringing out, Ferrum Dominus! The foe cometh! Oh, for the love of... Reid didn't need a translator to know what the hell that meant. They wanted him to fight. The Warlord rode at the head of his column, a towering figure in blackened armor, his tattered cloak snapping behind him as his horse thundered over the ridge. Even from this distance, Reid could tell, this one wasn't afraid. The others, the kneeling soldiers, the ones who had whispered prayers and bowed in reverence, they feared the unknown. The Warlord? He saw an opportunity. He pulled his mount to a halt just at the edge of the crater, surveying Fenrir's towering, battle-worn frame. The Warlord tilted his head, then let out a booming laugh. Reid's fingers twitched over his controls. Great, he muttered under his breath. This one thinks he's the main character. The Warlord raised a gauntleted hand, calling out in a deep, rough voice, his tone one of arrogant amusement. Reid couldn't make out every word, but he caught enough through the archaic inflection to get the gist. The Warlord thought Fenrir was a relic, a weapon from some forgotten age, a construct of steel and magic, and judging by the way he sneered at the kneeling soldiers, he intended to take it. Reid let out a slow breath. All right, time to think fast. Problems: no ammo. Weapons offline. Power core barely stable. Outnumbered. Advantages. He was sitting in a 6-story mech. Everyone here thought he was a war god. He could talk loud. Fine. If he couldn't fight his way out, he'd bluff. He toggled Fenrir's external speakers, setting the modulation to a lower register. The air shuddered as the mech's vocal system crackled to life. Step no further. The words boomed, distorted and deep, rolling across the battlefield like distant thunder. The Warlord's horse reared back, nearly throwing its rider. Some of the raiders flinched, gripping their weapons tighter. Even the kneeling soldiers dared to glance up wide-eyed. Reid watched, waiting, gauging, some hesitation. Good, but not enough. He needed more. He tapped a few controls, forcing Fenrir's optics to flicker erratically like something immense awakening. At the same time, he adjusted the mech's gyros just enough to make its frame groan, the servos straining in protest. The ground trembled. A few raiders stepped back, their hands tightening on their weapons. A few even turned their horses, shifting uncomfortably. Reid felt the tension shift, the uncertainty spread. Then the Warlord laughed again. Damn it! The bastard wasn't buying it. He barked something sharp, his voice cutting through the night. Reid caught the meaning instantly. Enough theatrics. Kill them all. The raiders charged. Oh, bloody hell. Reid had seconds to act. His bluff had failed. They weren't going to back down, and he had no weapons. Time for Plan B. He slammed both fists onto his controls, forcing Fenrir to lurch forward, just enough to send a shockwave through the crater. The mech's massive frame groaned like an awakening titan, and dust exploded outward from the impact of its weight shifting. The horses panicked first. Even the most seasoned war mounts had never seen anything like this. Several reared back, throwing their riders into the dirt. Others whinnied, eyes rolling in terror, resisting the charge. The hesitation rippled through the raiders, breaking their momentum. But the warlord? He didn't stop. His black stallion thundered forward, hooves kicking up dirt, his sword gleaming in the moonlight. He was coming straight for Fenrir, and Reid had nothing left. The warlord did not stop. His black stallion, its breath visible in the cold air, pounded forward, hooves sending clumps of dirt flying as he closed the distance. The man himself was a towering figure of muscle and menace, clad in darkened steel, his eyes fixed upon Fenrir with a gleam of conquest. His sword, wide and cruel, caught the light, reflecting it like a silver omen of death. "Cade Tay!" Out Moriere. Reid's helmet display flickered, straining against the interference from whatever unnatural energy saturated the air. The words meant nothing to him, but the intent behind them was clear. The warlord wasn't offering terms, he was delivering an ultimatum. Kneel, or die. Reid clenched his jaw. He had nothing left. No weapons, no shields, no power. Even if Fenrir had the strength for one last charge, there was no guarantee it would work. And if this turned into a drawn-out melee, the raiders would cut through the kneeling soldiers like wheat before the scythe. There was only one option, a dangerous, desperate one. His fingers moved instinctively, bypassing the dead neural interface and reaching for the manual release. With a hiss of depressurization, Fenrir's cockpit began to open. The soldiers below gasped as the towering iron beast split apart, steam curling from its seams like breath from the lungs of a sleeping giant. The kneeling warriors looked up, eyes wide, lips trembling as they beheld the true face of their Iron Lord. Not a god, not a demon. Just a man. Reid rose slowly from his seat, rolling his stiff shoulders as the cool air hit his face. His flight suit was torn and scorched. The grime of battle streaked across his skin. The green glow of emergency lighting within Fenrir framed his silhouette, giving him a ghostly, almost otherworldly presence. For a long moment no one moved. Then he raised his pistol. The sidearm was a sleek, modern thing, compact and efficient, nothing ornate, nothing flashy. But to the assembled warriors below, it may as well have been a divine artifact. Reid didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. A single sharp crack tore through the night. It was nothing like the twang of a bowstring, nor the deep clang of steel on steel. It was an explosion in miniature, a sound none of them had ever heard before. The horses screamed. Several raiders were thrown as their panicked mounts reared up, hooves thrashing. The kneeling soldiers flinched, their hands flying to their ears, eyes wide with terror. Reid let the silence stretch, his pistol still raised, his gaze locked on the warlord. But the warlord? He didn't flinch. Instead he laughed, a deep, rolling chuckle, full of contempt and amusement. Non timeo phantasmata, nec fragores fulgurum. Reid didn't need a translator to understand. I do not fear ghosts, nor the cracks of thunder. The warlord pulled his horse under control with a single brutal yank of the reins, then pointed his sword directly at Reid. Cade te machina nada, genuflecta ante-imperium. Submit, machine-born, you will kneel before the Empire. Reid exhaled slowly, muttering under his breath. Yeah, that's not happening. He fired again. This time, the bullet slammed into the warlord's shoulder. The impact sent the towering warrior reeling, his sword falling from his grasp as his body twisted violently in the saddle. Blood splattered across his black armor as he lost his balance and crashed to the ground. The battlefield froze. Every eye locked on Reid, the kneeling soldiers, the stunned raiders, even the injured warlord, propped on one elbow, his breath ragged and labored. They had all seen it. The Iron Lord had struck down a warlord of the Holy Empire with a single attack. Reid lowered his gun slightly, eyes narrowing. Still want to talk about kneeling? The warlord's face twisted in pure hatred. He didn't die. With grim determination, he planted his free hand into the dirt, forcing himself up. His wounded arm hung limp, but the man refused to show weakness. His bloodied lips curled into a snarl, and though he was breathing hard, his voice was still full of venom. Hoc non est finitum. This is not over. He staggered back toward his horse, mounting it with a gritted growl of pain. Tu genuflectes, tu clamabis, ed ego accipiem quod meum est. You will kneel, you will die screaming, and I will take what is mine. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode away. The surviving raiders hesitated only a moment longer, then followed their wounded master into the darkness, their retreating hoofbeats fading into the night. Reid watched them go, exhaling deeply. He holstered his pistol and rubbed the bridge of his nose. That was way too close. Then he looked down. The remaining soldiers, his soldiers now, were all on their knees. Bowing, Reid sighed. Reid stood there, staring down at the kneeling soldiers. They weren't just kneeling anymore. They were bowing, heads lowered, hands pressed to the dirt, postures rigid with reverence. The sight of it sent an uneasy weight settling in his chest. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. This just keeps getting weirder. Holstering his pistol, he climbed down from Fenrir, his boots landing with a dull thud against the scorched earth. The soldiers didn't move. Not one. Even as he walked past them, they remained prostrated, their breath slow as if awaiting some kind of decree. One of them rose. The gray-eyed soldier, the one who had first spoken to him, stood with measured precision, his movements controlled but respectful. His armor was battered, the crest on his shoulder faded but still distinct. Despite the awe in his gaze, he carried himself like a seasoned warrior. He pressed a fist to his chest, bowing slightly before speaking. I am Sir Aldrich of Veletria, captain of the Eastern Watch. If it please thee, my lord, may I know thy name? Reid blinked. The old-fashioned cadence caught him off guard. It wasn't quite Shakespearean, but it was close. Well, might as well play along. Captain Reid Voss, he answered, shifting his stance. No titles, no fancy names. Just Reid. Aldrich's brows furrowed slightly as if tasting the syllables. Then after a pause, he nodded. Reid. The pronunciation was slightly off, but the respect in his tone was evident. The warrior took another step forward, standing at attention. Reid met his gaze. All right. Someone want to tell me where the hell I am? Aldrich hesitated for only a moment before speaking. His words were slow, careful, but filled with the weight of ritual and reverence. You stand upon the lands of Veletria, my lord. Veletria? That didn't mean a damn thing to him. Reid crossed his arms, rolling his shoulders to shake off the tension. And that charming bastard that just left? Aldrich's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. He is a commander of the Holy Empire of Alaris, a dog of the Divine Order. Reid's brow arched. Right. And you're at war. Aye, my lord. Aldrich's voice was solemn. The Empire calls us apostates, for we do not kneel before their gods. They seek to bring our lands to heel. His hand clenched into a fist over his chest. We resist. Well, that explained the whole submit or die speech. Reid scratched at the stubble along his jaw, thinking, and I'm guessing since I just shot their guy in the shoulder, I'm on your side now? Aldrich's lips curled into something like a smirk. Aye. Great. So much for neutrality. A shift rippled through the assembled warriors. The murmurs had begun again, low and reverent. Ferrum Dominus, the Iron Lord. He could hear the whispers passing between them, like they were afraid speaking too loudly might break the illusion of him standing before them. Reid resisted the urge to sigh. Aldrich took a deep breath, then lowered his head slightly. My lord. Ah, here it comes. The princess must see you with her own eyes. She will know what is to be done. Princess? Fantastic. The last thing he needed was royalty getting involved. Still, Reid wasn't in a position to argue. His mech was dead weight, and these people seemed far less inclined to stab him than the other guys. A castle probably meant food, water, and shelter. 3 things he was going to need real soon. How far? A day's march, my lord. Reid sighed, rubbing his temples. Of course it is. Aldrich tilted his head slightly. Would you wish to ride, my lord? He gestured toward a nervous-looking horse being held at the rear. Reid shot the creature a glance. It snorted, eyes rolling at him. Yeah, no, he muttered. I don't trust those things. Aldrich didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned to his men and lifted a hand. Reid felt it before he saw it. A faint hum in the air. A charge like static before a storm. Then movement. Fenrir rose. Slowly, impossibly, the massive war machine lifted off the ground, its weight seemingly defying logic. The staff-bearing soldiers had stepped forward, their hands outstretched, their staffs crackling faintly with energy. They were lifting the mech. Magic. No tech, no pulleys, no external thrusters. Just magic. Reid's jaw tightened. His first instinct was to call bullshit, but the evidence was right in front of him. It wasn't just a vague, mystical force. It was real. Tangible, he muttered under his breath. Okay, that's actually kinda cool. Aldrich smirked slightly. You have seen but a fraction of what our mages can do, my lord. Reid exhaled. One problem at a time. The soldiers turned and began their march. Fenrir floated behind them, carried effortlessly by the combined power of their magic. Reid fell into step beside them, his mind already working through the next set of problems. He had a feeling this was only the beginning.